A very, very good afternoon to all of you. We at Citizens for Justice and Peace are extremely privileged to have with us Professor Anup Surendranath, Assistant Professor of Law, Executive Director, Project 39A from the National Law University, Delhi. But that's like putting it too formally. I think the work done by Professor Surendranath on the whole question of not just death penalty, but the rights of those who are on death row and the way society should look at them, and sort of matching research, academic research, and actual empirical research and practice, and trying to make a difference to the lives of those on death row has been quite inspirational, setting off this project. Thank you so much, Professor Surendranath, for being with us. I thought today we would talk not just about the death row issue, which is of course vital, but we look at the whole issue of prison conditions, because it's an issue which, it sort of dogs us every time. And somehow both as society and state, we've not really been able to, look it in the eye and grapple with it. And despite some statutory movements in like the 2016 Prisoners Manual, several judgments of the courts, particularly the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court, we are not somehow able to crack the hegemony of the prison bureaucracy. So I just thought we look at the whole issue of prison conditions and monitoring of those conditions. So your first thoughts.
Thank you, Ms. Ethelward, for having me here, and the privilege is all mine, I must say. And thank you also for all the work that you've done over the years. Yes, I think the conversation on prisons is one that hasn't received enough attention over the years, especially in terms of conditions of prisons, oversight of prisons, and even, I would say, even very basic prison statistics, right? I think even the most basic empirical data of our prisons is not available, let alone access to those prisons and surveying those conditions inside prisons. I think that it's literally a closed world, and very little light goes through those walls and gates in more ways than one. So it is great that we're having this conversation and sort of try and think about why it is so difficult, right? And why are prisons so closed to outside, I wouldn't even say monitoring, to even outside understanding of what is happening inside, right? And I think if you go too quickly into the monitoring mold, everybody gets defensive, right? But even just understanding, we just don't have it. And I think much of that needs that sort of very basic level understanding first before we get into policy prescriptions. And I think the state seems to think that outsiders are bad in this, particularly in this area, right? At least in my experience with the criminal justice system across, I don't know, courts or legal aid institutions, prisons are the most opaque and the most resistant to outsiders.
So actually, that's a very good way of putting it, that before we go into the statutes and the laws about monitoring, let's just talk about why does this not have any currency in the public mind, in the public space, in public concerns? And what does that say about us as a people, as a society, and of course the state? Related to this was my question, which is, we find an increasingly callous and influential quote-unquote urban elite, which seems to cry revenge and vendetta instead of reformative justice, if you like. And, as we know, prisons are supposed to be mirrors of what society is, in any case, in a very rigid and truncated form. So what and who do you believe is responsible for this extremely shrill vendetta-like assertion? And where do we feel as human rights workers, do we need to focus to maybe bring a shift in attitude? And just one more additional question in this, to this aspect, is that what is the role of the media, or what should be the role of the media?
Right. I think as to why, as a society, we don't care really, and I think it's true generally of prisoners as a category, is perhaps across the world that category of persons who receive the least amount of priority and attention in terms of this, what the state is doing with them. And I think that's because there is a certain perception of people who commit crime and why they commit it. And that feeds into that public conversation that you're talking about. It's a very shrill, sharp conversation of wanting to punish more and punish faster. And when I say punish more, it means more higher punishments and punish more things. Right?
Yeah.
And if you look at the trajectory of criminal law in India, even in even the post 2000s, we have criminalized so many things. We have increased punishments, and our answer to all social problems, imagined or otherwise, right? It seems to be harsher punishments, right? Criminalize it, right? And put people away, right? We seem to be stuck in that rut where we think that punishment can solve social problems, right? And we know that's far from true, right? The production of crime, even if we were like thinking of crimes that none of us would doubt is a crime, the production of crime is a deeply sociological phenomenon, right? Why people commit crimes is not just a question of some sort of wiring in my head going wrong and therefore I commit a crime. It's all of us are responsible, right, for the production of crime. Our families, our friends, our governments, our societies, right? Our media, right? We all have a role to play in the production of crime, right? But suddenly and I think especially on sexual violence, I would say that I think it's often a reflection of our own frustration and helplessness that we live in a society that allows those kinds of things to happen. And I just don't think we have the sort of honesty within ourselves to admit that we are also responsible in producing, right? And therefore that sort of demonizing happens, right? That demonizing of persons who are accused and convicted of offenses happens. And I think we are happy to then pass on that frustration and helplessness and disgust with ourselves to say, okay, these are the people who are, to project it and say, these are the people who are responsible, right? And I think that's just one context in, let's say, sexual violence. I think if you look at other contexts, you can do this, like the cow slaughter laws, right?
Yeah.
I think it's absolutely ridiculous that you criminalize something like that, and the kinds of punishment that come
unbelievable.
It's unbelievable, right? Even going to life imprisonment in certain states, right? It's and I think the court is partly responsible, right? And I think the court has not done sufficient work on thinking through that on what basis should we adjudicate these things of criminalization, punishment. And there has been such great deference on questions of what is a proportionate response, what kinds of punishment can we have for what kind of offenses. All of those are sort of constitutional gaps that exist in our jurisprudence. And there hasn't been any meaningful judicial discussion on it. And therefore, you are left with where the judiciary is highly deferential on questions of criminalization and on quantum of punishment to the political executive.
Actually, that's a very interesting point you make, because you had a stint as you were invited by the Supreme Court to actually assist on research projects and understanding of aspects of, I guess, all the issues we are talking about, or some of these issues we are talking about. Should this not be regularized much more, that you have a kind of interface between rigorous academia, empirical research, other kinds of research, anthropological research, sociological research, and what the judiciary needs to be kept informed about? before they come to decisions, particularly on such crucial issues.
I mean, talking of the stint, I think it's a stint that both they and I would like to forget. But anyway.
I was going to bring it up at the end, but then you gave me an opening. So I said I must.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Yeah.
no, I think
Yeah.
there is, the time that I spent there, and particularly when Justice Lodha was the Chief Justice, it was interesting to see the conversations they wanted to have, right? And just the capacity just doesn't exist in an institution like that. And people like me are necessarily misfits in an institution like that. But we shouldn't be, is the point. And I think
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
point I'm
That's
making,
correct.
that we shouldn't be misfits. And unless courts, I mean, especially the Supreme Court, is interested in looking at issues and developing its own understanding in a non-adjudicatory context.
That's right. That's right. In an abstract sense, before the case comes before it. Yeah.
Right, and a case has its own logic, and you know that very well.
Exactly.
Right? And it has its what is relevant, what is not relevant, what can you argue, what can't you argue. It has a very stifling journey in that sense. A case, and I think judges and even lawyers, right, need to have that much broader understanding of the legal system. And I think that just isn't there, right? I don't think we are a legal system that is too fond of empiricism, either quantitatively or qualitatively. We are not too fond. That's reflected even in our legal education, right?
Yeah.
That's not something that we're taught or teach as teachers now. So in that sense, that investment of resources and prioritizing in learning about the realities of India's legal system, I would be fascinated to know. You hear of these times when Charles Sobraj raised his issues with Tihar.
Yep.
You had Beg, I think it was Beg, if I'm not wrong, Beg, Krishna Iyer, and Kailasam. Going to Tihar, right?
Yeah.
And I really wonder how many judges have really been to a sub-jail in a district or, right?
In fact, that's one of the statutory requirements. Forget the Supreme Court, like you mentioned, these three eminent jurists going there. But the statutory requirement, as you well know, is that district and sessions judge visit jails as a matter of course, as a matter of their own education, as a matter of their own judicial duty. And that's just not happening. And
I think a big problem is, to sort of very broadly frame it, I don't think judges and lawyers, especially the lawyers who argue these big cases, often deal with matters that are very divorced from their own lived experiences and their own realities, right? And there is a need to learn about it and be made aware of it, and that can't happen when a case is being argued, and therefore that institutional learning needs to happen, right? And just doesn't happen as it is.
Actually, that's a very, very important point, because I think that's a fundamentally different way we should be needing to looking at adjudication and criminal jurisprudence, which is evolving. We are saying this about a kind of a rapacious elite, which is hysterical vis-a-vis prisons. But it's this spiral that has gone upwards in our case, India's case, has also gone hand in hand with complete impunity for mass crimes, and which have got huge amount of societal accolades almost, if they're hate crimes and stuff like that. So you see on the other hand that there is an acceptance that is all right and that is allowed, whereas a certain kind of punishment is necessary for a certain kind of people and a certain kind of crime.
Right.
So we are seeing.
Sorry.
No. That's what I wanted to say.
That's such an interesting point, right? And then I often think about, while working on the death penalty, what are we even talking about? You're talking about a society where extrajudicial killings, right, and encounter deaths are celebrated, right? And when that kind of loss of life doesn't really trouble us or move us really, right? Then talking about the death penalty is like a huge mountain to climb, right?
Yeah.
Custodial
torture.
And these are things that uh, in public discourse, in even popular media or entertainment, are things that are portrayed in such a celebratory manner, right? Such laudatory fashion. And I think we very often, and then when you said what is the role of the media, it's, I would say, media and entertainment, right? In sort of saying that celebrated cop is the encounter cop.
Yeah.
And that's we live in a time when or in times when life is so devalued, right? Life is so devalued when death and suffering just doesn't move us, I think. I mean, we're just so attuned to it as a society.
We just look at the last 3 months and what has happened in the second wave, and we seem to be all coming out of it virtually unscathed, despite the bodies on the Ganga and all of that.
Yeah. And I think, memory plays such a difficult role in this, right? And while during those few weeks, we were all troubled, but as you rightly said, we seem to be coming out of it rather well, if I may say.
Coming back to the question of prison conditions, and which is sort of keeps dogging us, this COVID-19 pandemic posed a great challenge in one sense, within and outside prison, of course, and they, of course, expose other structural issues, dark underbellies, if it were, casteism, class difference, communalism, etc., and of course the realities of our prisons. Some courts also, our constitutional court, Supreme Court, etc., did turn their gaze a little bit on prison conditions, ordered the release, set up these high-powered committees. How far and deep did that gaze go is my question. And do you expect that this gaze to linger and to stay in the future so that real solutions to prison conditions are really found? I mean, in one sense, even Devangana and Natasha's very valiant attempt to get everybody vaccinated inside Tihar jail. These are baby steps, if you like, but the fact is they did it, it turned the gaze on, it raised the issue. But like they've said when they've come out and they've said to some of us when we're speaking to them that they're worried about Gulfishan, they're worried about others. We saw Asif Iqbal Tana's experience, which was so different. We are seeing lots of things in play. We are seeing Ishrat Jahan, who's in Mandoli, not Tihar. And there's this real concern about her safety, given how her fellow prisoners are treating her. And these are just the names we know, because they're activists, but there are so many others.
And largely Tihar, right?
Yeah.
We are talking about Tihar, right? You can only imagine.
Mandoli. Ishrat is Mandoli.
Yeah. But you can imagine that's a state in the capital territory.
Yeah.
Right? What is happening elsewhere? No, but on the question of the gaze, I think it is to the court's credit that it was one of the first issues during the pandemic that was taken up.
That's right.
And the high-powered committees were formed, and I think that story will be written in due course on how the high-powered committees performed and in different states. But I think my quibble with the framing of the gaze, as you rightly put it, and I think it was a gaze. I must admit that, right? It sent a certain amount of. We started the conversation by saying we know so little. We are allowed to see so little, and this gaze allowed, I think, an interesting amount of light into the jails. It did. In terms of saying, in what conditions are people living? Right? They live so close to each other. What are the sanitation conditions like? How overcrowded is it? It did bring up that conversation. But I think just the framing of the gaze as a decongestion conversation, and not a right to health conversation. I would have rather had that, and I think it has had interesting consequences, right? And worrying consequences when it is framed as a decongestion conversation. And what do I mean?
Or a budgetary problem,
Yes, right?
Hmm.
Because when you say decongestion, then you immediately ask the next question: who do we decongest, right? Who do we let out, right? And there you saw all this problematic criteria coming up,
Yeah.
right? It has to be under 7 years, right? If it's sexual offense, not allowed. If it's offense against the state, not allowed. And that, because you were having it as a decongestion conversation, it allowed that conversation to be about whose release should we prioritize and not prioritize. And there it went into a conversation about, again, going back to an earlier theme, about which crimes are we sort of
Okay
uh,
with and which we are not okay with. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, right? That's exactly what the conversation happened. And you can see why a right to health conversation might have been a very different conversation,
Yeah.
right? Then you can't say, oh, some people have right to health and some people don't have right to health,
No. Yeah.
right? That it's everyone's right to health. And how do you ensure everyone's right to health? That what is required from a right to health obligation is very different, or would have been very different from what is required as a decongestion obligation,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, and I think that's something for us to really think about, and a lesson for the future, I would think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite fascinating what you're saying, because if you look at the Gautam Navlakha judgment of May
Yeah.
2021, which is a pretty substantial judgment, and it does look at this whole question of 118% occupancy, 4,78,600 prisoners, the congestion, burden on the state exchequer, all of that. But then it also makes a little bit of a leap without dwelling too much upon the reasons for the leap. When it talks about age, it talks about backgrounds, academics. I mean, it's a kind of two lines where it says, when certain kind of prisoners are there, then we should consider house arrest, because at least they would then have their right to health and medical facilities. So, there's a little bit of a window opens up again for maybe a different kind of incarceration.
Yes.
Which gives a little, of course, we all know house arrest itself is contested, and in different societies and different times, everyone has looked at it differently. It's looked at humiliation, blah, blah. But whether it's house arrest, open prisons, I mean, unless we don't start looking at some of these quote unquote optional ways of trying to look at reformative justice and not retributive justice,
Yeah, but having said all of this, Lisa, I think I would say that I was very glad for at least that the time for which it was a mainstream conversation, both in the court and in the media, right? And I think there's a lesson there for us, right? And I think there's a lesson there for us that it can be made part of a mainstream conversation, right? And how all of us who work in this space in different capacities can do that is something for us to talk about in the future, right? And not to ensure that prison conversation is not a conversation we have once in 10 years, right? Or something when terrible happens, right? It's a consistent conversation. And I think there are enough stories there to engage the public.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point, because coming back again to the whole question of monitoring, okay, now like the formal issue of monitoring, which is what with the statutory, at least on paper, requires, that it was an innovative, I'm just emphasizing the point you made, that it was an innovative construct of the Delhi High Court in the first instance in the Navlakha case that allowed the house arrest, because of that technical remand issue. And then there was a huge thing that Gautam had to surrender Navlakha and then etc. and then came up for bail. But even that opening of the window for house arrest and the Supreme Court telling courts that you examine this as a possibility, I think is quite important, very, very important, and and needs to be furthered in public discourse.
Yes.
I mean, prison monitoring, as much or better than me, that we have the model prison manuals, we have the state prison manuals. They all lay down quote unquote proper and sustained system of monitoring, despite their whole epistemology, which was colonial and it was pretty brutal. But it includes, like I was saying, the visits of sessions and district judges by board of visitors, who are supposed to maintain registers, take stock, have access to every prisoner, maintain a diary. But, we just don't see that happening. I mean, there are
Yeah.
reports after reports, and we see that this monitoring falls by the wayside for a variety of reasons. And
Yeah.
I just wanted to get to that a little bit. That
Yeah.
I mean,
And-
how does even
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. Please.
no, formal as it may seem, and obviously we need to have the broader conversation before this happens or along with it. We also need to say that, listen, if you have these rules on your statute book, these laws in your statute books, you can't not implement them. You know,
Yeah.
you just cannot not implement them, because I mean, I've heard absolute horror stories, as I'm sure you have, of some of the most well-established prisons where absolute privileges are enjoyed by the criminal mafia.
Yeah.
Absolute privileges. And it's important. It's very difficult to document all of this because people fear that if they document it, they lose whatever privileges they've got out of them, parole or out of bail or whatever it is. So one has to talk in these vague generalities, like even when I'm interviewing you, But one knows of instances where it's shocking the kind of level of privileges a certain criminal mafia can get because of his or her connections.
Yeah, I mean, I often think, right, if our prisons were occupied by people of a very different profile, right, their lawyers would ensure that these things happen properly, right? I mean, and one thinks so, right? And I think it is intrinsically connected to that in terms of that you're talking of the kind of privilege that you talk about is then done as favors of very different kinds to a very powerful elite section, but the vast majority belong to very vulnerable sections of our society.
Correct.
And are therefore very helpless to do anything about the kind of mismanagement, atrocities, and torture that is inflicted in our prisons. But Teesta, I think there is a sort of a deeper point here that I'd just like to reflect on with you, actually. Right? You're right? There is a formal framework, either in terms of what judgments have said or what the prison manuals do, or even international conventions or whatever.
Absolutely.
Right? And yet, and there is this widespread conversation that prisons are institutions for reform. Right?
Yeah.
Right? And yet, you see all these realities that you spoke about happening, right? And there is that disjunct between the formal narrative that we are interested in reform and all these other systems that we have established feed into that larger institutional goal of reform that sits rather uncomfortably with the kind of torture and violence and unhygienic conditions and really deplorable conditions in which human beings are made to live, right? And I think and even the prison practices, if you look at in a sort of a daily sense, right from what can you access, right? What kind of opportunities, what kind of work do you do, who gets to do what kind of work, right?
Can you read books or not? Can you read newspapers or not? Yeah.
Exactly, right? Can you meet your family in private or not?
Yeah.
Right? Can your family send you food inside into prison? Right? Now, this, I mean, and the sense that there are a lot of these day-to-day things that function at a very, how do I say this? I mean, it's a very interpersonal equation with prison authorities, right?
Yeah.
And there, the logic driving that is one of, the logic that's driving that is not one of reform, right?
No.
So while the institutional conversation is one of reform, one sees that disjunct in the day-to-day practices where it is a lot of doing favors, currying favors, who gets to work in the as these convict officers, right?
Yeah.
So all these are
Who cleans the toilets? Who cleans the
correct.
toilets? Always made to clean the toilets.
Yeah. And recently there was an exceptional article I thought in the Wire on
That's right.
On the caste foundations of the
Sukanya's work. Yeah.
I thought it was just so insightful. Right. So, and I think it sits rather uncomfortably the daily realities of prison life and the broad policy legal conversation on what are we trying to do with our prisons, right? And that disjunct would start to explain this push and pull that you see. Actually, I mean, you don't see any push and pull. Actually, I mean, the reality of that is pretty grim, right? And unless we start to talk about that, and as you said, we are forced to talk in generalities, and unless we start to talk in those day-to-day specificities, this contradiction is going to exist between we are saying one thing at a policy level and our prisons are doing something completely different and contradictory on the other, right?
Which is why I feel that we need to, however formalistic it sounds, Anup, I think we need to say, where is your board of visitors? Why is the visit not happening? Where is your register? And we need to demand uploading of this on the internet, that we need to say that this is a public document, it's a public visit, taxpayers' mandate. We need to know whether these processes at all are happening or not.
Yes.
And if they are not happening, what is the reason? Okay, just now you have the pandemic as an excuse for every other oppression under the sun, But as and when things improve, I think this is the conversations we should be aiming to have and push for. I really believe that, because otherwise we'll have lost this moment that these openings have given us. These young persons being incarcerated and facing it so bravely in Delhi, or the Bhima Koregaon case, they've given us opportunities to be able to raise some of these issues,
Absolutely. I'd agree. Yes, you're right. I mean, that formality, it might exist as in that formal sense, but there is an opportunity in using that, even though it's there only for the formal sense.
That's right.
For people to use those tools to achieve those ends of justice, as one might call it. Right? Yeah.
Because the point that you made, that, the kind of lawyers who certain kind of persons, political prisoners, I'm using the word that we were referring to, that political prisoners would be able to access, would immediately say, where is my mulaqat? Where is my medical relief? Am I getting enough books? Am I getting any this thing? But a certain kind of prisoner doesn't even have somebody can apply for her bail. So she's just languishing like an under trial, picked up from some railway station somewhere or whatever.
Yeah.
And they just don't have the wherewithal to navigate an extremely hostile legal system.
Absolutely.
So, but to be able to ensure that at least there is some gaze on her or him who doesn't have, I think we need to insist on these mechanisms which are very formalistic. They sound very formalistic, but I think we need to just insist on them as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your work with Project 39A, among the most startling things about it was also this whole socio-economic, deconstruction, and it showed the intersectionality of, if you like, discrimination. That certain sections were much more on death row than anybody else. Yeah. Would you say that would also apply to India's prisons and those who are under trials and don't have access to justice?
Yeah, I think it's true of India. It's true of any other society in the world, that it's the most vulnerable and the marginalized that are incarcerated the most, right? And I think that structural injustice plays out at multiple levels, right from the moment of what are you criminalizing, to police investigation, to custody, to the experience with the court process, right? And then also incarceration.
How witnesses are treated in the witness box.
Exactly.
I mean, I experienced this firsthand during the Best Bakery retrial in Mumbai, because that was my first day-to-day handling of a trial of that nature. And I realized that whether it was that one or the Narora Patia Special Courts trial in Ahmedabad, Gujarat, the difference between having a sensitive judicial officer, a judge, and one that is not, makes such a difference to a witness who's from a socio-economic profile, who's anyway been traumatized, who's seen mass crime, who's seen rapes and murder happening in front of her eyes, and is expected to depose with a very hostile structural system and the defense,
Yeah.
But that witness box also, I just find it's just...
And I think all of these contradictory experiences that we all have seen between what the law promises and what the law delivers, right? Or the system promises and the system delivers, have such deeper roots, right? I mean, you're talking of a legal system that was never really changed from the colonial times, right? Even though,
despite Article 74 saying right? They say constitutionalize all your laws, but that never happened.
Yeah. And you have a legal system that is wholly unsuited for the people that it is meant for, right? Both our procedures, just the architecture of it, the kind of processes that courts follow is just wholly unsuited for our society, right? And we just haven't thought of what are those transformative changes that the legal system needs to make it user-friendly for the kind of people that use it. Right? And I mean, I think it's far, it's I think for people like you and me, it's far easier to navigate it. But not for the person who really comes in touch with it, in conflict with it. Most often, right?
So coming to the question about which I said something about Dalits, Muslims, poorer people being greater victims of this kind of incarceration. Do you think something like voting rights for prisoners would make a difference? Campaigns like that would make any difference at all? Apart from, of course, this monitoring thing that we've talked about a little bit. I mean, how do we prize open these conversations?
Teesta, I'm sure you saw that status of policing report by Lokniti and CSDS in 2019, right? And I just want to answer your question in a sort of roundabout way, right? Where, it was so revealing where they interviewed about nearly 12,000 police persons, and almost one in about, I think 70% that they believe that Muslims are more naturally inclined to crime.
Criminal. Yes.
And about 30% said Dalits are more naturally inclined to crime. So you're talking of a system that has inherent bias in its very constitutive elements, right? Right. Now, when you when you have bias operating in its constitutive elements, that is obviously going to reflect in all the processes down the road, right? Right. And therefore, you see that your prison population is of a certain profile, right? And then the question of how do we solve this? And and I think yes, law can be your guide and mentor in this journey, but I don't think it will deliver the goods on its own. I think we very often exaggerate what the law can deliver, right? And I think while an issue like this is so intrinsically tied to our social and political relations, right, and dynamics, and unless that kind of structural change is possible, I think we will have to use the law to the best that we can. That's it, right? It's more like a temporary band-aid, I would think, more than really curing the problem, right? And I think that band-aid is important. I mean, it's not to deny. But voting rights, on the particular issue of voting rights, I think in a strange kind of way, I think, Teesta, it feeds into what we were talking about, how these conditions itself are inhumane, right? You really wouldn't keep, you really wouldn't have human beings live in these conditions. And I think the denial of the vote is a sort of dehumanizing logic.
Process.
Right? It's a dehumanizing logic. Just like in the various contexts in which we have seen denial of disenfranchisement, right? In various other contexts in the world, it is part of that process, right? It's easy to, it's part of that dehumanizing experience and logic that our prisons perpetuate, right? I mean, from a purely political sense, I mean, from a purely electoral sense, would it make a difference?
No, it's only 4 lakh people all over the country.
Exactly.
So it won't. But I'm just talking about in terms of raising issues in multiple ways, in terms of being able to engage a campaign.
Yeah.
Because people, because that was also one of my questions, that how do we make some of these human rights issues questions of political concern? You know, because today the political class seems to be wanting to go completely conservative, not wanting to raise any issues, wanting to stay away from quote unquote issues that talk about human rights, etc. Because the right wing is so shrill, the ultra right wing, that they feel that they'll just be pushed into a corner.
Yeah.
You know. So any ideas for what sort of campaigns we need to raise around the issue of prisons, prisoners' rights, dignity, right to life, right to health, like you said?
You've touched on a pet peeve of mine, actually, which is this, right? And I'm just going to be provocative, and it'd be great to hear from you what you think of what I'm just about to say, right? I think all the kind of forces that you spoke about, right, that are pushing back this conversation, that are resisting this conversation, are such experts at the communication game, right? They are so good at it, right? And I think all of us wanting to have those conversations are way behind in understanding, learning, and executing how people consume information in this day and age, right? And unless we up our game on that, right, I think we are only going to be preaching to the choir, right? And unless we learn to communicate and tell stories and put out those messages effectively, and start first getting the people on the fence to our side. And I don't think we are sort of advocating anything that is violent or divisive or anything of that sort. I mean, I think if people were to actually see some of this, right? Now, if you were to take 100 people of the people that you started the conversation with, or if you said that, you know, prisoners are the worst kind of people in our society, you know, they should be damned. If you took those 100 people to a prison and really showed them how those conditions are, by just, I believe, by virtue of being human beings, right, there is a certain impact that will have, right?
I agree.
Right? And again, it's so easy to say that, oh, let's hang people, because there is a sense of abstraction to these conversations, right?
Yeah,
that
but when you see a face and a
right? It's easy for you to just remove yourself and say, oh, these prisons also, what's so wrong? They have done a crime, so they must go and live in these conditions, right? But the larger point being, unless we win and start to think about the communication war, right? I think just being on the right side, or being on the good side, right, is not enough, right? I don't think we are in that day and age anymore, and that's what I would think, right? That we need to tell stories, and we need to tell stories very, very well. Right?
I agree. So I think the stories have to come with the numbers have to come with the conditions, and the conditions, and there has to be a certain repetitiveness about it without it getting boring and cliched, you know, so that it sticks in people's minds. I think there can be no there can be no arguing with your pet theme, and I'm fully with you on that. my only thing is that maybe right, I would add it that one way of actually doing this well is to encourage multiple ways of doing it. Because, even in communication, I think there are multiple ways. There's the short, there's the long, there's the story, there's the music. And if it allows different ways of it, you just don't know which one might click when and where,
It appeals to different things. Different things appeal to different people.
Yeah, different people. But I think this idea that you have, that maybe among the most skeptical, if not hardline people who believe prisons are of a certain kind, let's try and encourage those people and take them for a prison visit. I think that's a very, very good place to end today's conversation. Because I do believe that you need to have certain experiences out of which you can then realize maybe a shift in your beliefs. And
I would start by our judges visiting prisons, right? The Supreme Court judges going to prisons. I don't know if they go or don't go, but certainly go more often. Yeah.
No, I think that actually would be a very good place to start, that we tell our judges from the Supreme Court and the High Courts that you need to visit prisons and actually see and allow the prisoners to talk to you without the bureaucracy being in the way, without the prison bureaucracy standing next to you and giving you the tips. No, just take a walk and see, and are the conditions even mildly all right? I mean, then you can judge for yourselves.
And anyway, that's a great first step that all of us maybe can work towards, a concrete step. Getting our judges to
I think it would make a very, very powerful first step by the Indian judiciary, particularly the constitutional courts. If they were to say that, yes, we want to start by giving the courage to the district sessions judges to do their statutory job, but let's start and do what Krishnayar Beg and Kailasam did when Sobraj made those statements about Bihar. And let's say that we'll step down and we'll step out of our little silos and do this. I think that's a wonderful way to conclude today's conversation. Yeah. And I do hope we'll have more of these, because I think these need to be in the nature of explorations in terms of trying to break through into some new areas.
And I think absolutely conversations, and I think difficult conversations and not easy conversations. And these are, I think, areas, and I have no point in me saying this to you with all your experience. I think one thing that we really need to do is to combine efforts, right? I think far too much work happens in silos, right?
No, and actually I keep believing that for the human rights movement, if we don't realize it's a time to build alliances, really strong, lasting alliances, so that we learn from each other's experience and gain from it, and maybe partner ourselves better. We just can't afford to be working alone in little pathways at all. Fully, we are fully with you on that, and whatever guidance you can give us to the little bit we are doing, we really look forward to it. Forward to it.
Really. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anu. Please take care. Yeah.
Bye-bye. You too.